From Software has established itself recently as the guys who make third-person action RPGs, so it can be forgiven to look at Sekiro and expect more of the same. In practice, however, Sekiro is far more different than the usual formula. It has enough to be familiar, but I'd hesitate strongly to call this similar to the previous Souls games, and it's likely thanks to From Software stretching their creative muscles and taking risks that they've created one of their greatest games yet. Sekiro sets the scene as war-torn Japan, with rival clans looking to take over the Ashina region. Meanwhile, a coup organized by the powerful soldier Genichiro seeks to overthrow the current government and obtain heretical superpowers so that he might defend his country from invasion in his own way. Our main character, Wolf, is in charge of escorting a young lord who Genichiro is attempting to kidnap to meet his own goals, but he fails miserably. Thanks to his power of resurrection and an awesome new prosthetic arm provided by an old ninja, Wolf must storm Ashina Castle, rescue the young Lord Kuro, and discover the truth behind the power of resurrection and what it means for the rest of Japan, if not the lands beyond. Unlike the previous Souls games where the story is largely implied, Sekiro's narrative is very upfront. It certainly helps that the main character has a name this time and his own motivations to follow, but beyond that, there is far less emphasis on reading item descriptions and a lot more direction for the story in general. Aside from the ridiculous fantasy setting, it's actually pretty down to earth, and it restrains itself quite a bit. The cinematography, character blocking, and acting are all great. Well, maybe not so much the acting per se. Most characters are rather emotionless, but I could see this being a legit samurai flick.
Accept me to your immortal oath.
I cannot do that, Lord Genichiro. Your victory that day means nothing. He will risk his life to take me home. For he is my shinobi.
My lord, I have come for you. This will only take a moment.
And as emotionless as it may be, it's still way better acted than freaking stone-faced Norman Reedus. Compared to the other Souls games, there are a lot more cutscenes and a lot more dialogue to get through. And it is unfortunate to have the action occasionally grind to a halt. However, it does strike a pretty good balance and rarely does it get aggravating. Unlike Code Vein, for example, in which about half the entire game is just cutscene after cutscene. From Software has made a name for themselves, in part by putting together some pretty dazzling scenery, with Bloodborne arguably being one of their crowning achievements. But with Sekiro, they have outdone themselves. Part of it is no doubt thanks to the Japanese setting, which is a nice break from the usual medieval European castles and whatnot. But even with that in mind, this is some excellent art direction and fascinating locales to explore. You've got the typical Japanese castle, of course, but then there's the insane Buddha colony high in the mountains, the dark fishing village full of zombies crawling out of the ground, the narrow valley with gigantic Buddha statues. Okay, there's actually quite a bit of Buddhist imagery in this game, but it all looks really cool. This stuff is legitimately beautiful, and it sparks a sense of wonder that encourages exploration. It's also way easier to explore than ever before. Unlike the previous Souls games, I'm probably gonna keep saying that quite a bit. There's no stamina in Sekiro, and you can jump too, as well as kick off walls and use predetermined grapple hook points throughout the environment. This makes it really easy to zip through the entire game, especially if you already know where to go, and it cuts down on a lot of downtime. If you're also having a really hard time against a particular boss, you can pretty easily run past all the enemies and straight to the arena as well. However, this does bring me to a bit of an issue. It feels too easy to just zip through the whole game like this. Almost pointless even. I mean, I get it, no one likes having to do that run to the boss every time you die, it's annoying and it takes a while. But that's part of the punishment. Just don't die next time. With Sekiro's case, you basically just get to restart a boss with hardly any consequences. It's rather odd, to say the least, considering how From Software has been structuring their games lately. Granted, you no longer drop your experience and money upon death, instead you lose 50% of what you had on you immediately with very little chance of recourse. However, this can be easily alleviated as well. You can buy bags of money as a method of banking your cash, and you level up automatically as soon as you gain enough experience points. And once you do, those points are then instantly safe. That 50% loss really isn't that big of a deal. It seems that, as an alternative form of punishment, the Dragon Rot mechanic was implemented. This makes it so that each time the player dies, they will spread a sickness to other characters in the game, mostly merchants, and it's implied that they will eventually die from this sickness, and it will be caused by Wolf's constant resurrections. In theory, it sounds interesting, if not overly harsh. It would certainly make the game a lot more difficult if you start losing merchants with little control over it, but more importantly, it'll give the player that same kind of anxiety that they would have gotten from the previous Souls games. However, in practice, I don't think anyone ever dies due to Dragon Rot, and I lost count of how many times I died in the game and everyone seemed fine. They never stopped coughing, but I mean, it's whatever. It comes off more as a cheap scare tactic since it never really does anything. Outside of jumping around and grapple hooks, the gameplay has its similarities to the Souls games, but it's handled quite differently. Regular attacks are regulated to the usual spamming of the R1 button, while special attacks are done by blocking and attacking at once. And using the special tools of the Shinobi prosthetic are regulated to the R2 button, which is like magic in the previous games. There's a fair bit of variety here thanks to all the tools that can be unlocked, as well as the different attacks that can be done while jumping and dodging. However, the basic combat is far more simplistic in comparison to the previous games, mainly due to the fact that there's only one weapon, no armor, and the RPG stats are practically non-existent. Hidden throughout the game and after certain boss fights, the player will be rewarded with either health or attack power upgrades. But that's it for raw stats. Experience points earned can be put towards learning new abilities from a few skill trees unlocked in the game, and upgrade materials can be used to unlock more powerful tools. But this aspect of the game is bare bones compared to the more flexible Souls games where players could put together a unique build and playstyle that appeals to them. A friend of mine described it as saying that Sekiro demands a specific approach from the player, and I definitely agree with that. If you don't play the game the way that it wants you to, then you're going to have a bad time. That doesn't necessarily make it bad, and I do think that Sekiro is fun as hell, but it'll likely throw a lot of people for a loop as it's a huge departure from Software's previous pedigree. On top of that, Sekiro's upgrade tree is a real pain. Some sections won't even unlock until certain tools are discovered, leaving the player gimped if they miss something in particular. Furthermore, the later tools and skills to unlock are absurdly expensive, and it's unrealistic to come even close to unlocking everything on the first playthrough. I did manage to get 100% completion, but it took me 5 playthroughs to do it. Even then, the upgrades don't change a whole lot anyway, and aside from specific bosses and situations, Sekiro still pretty much plays the same from the start of the game to the end. The pace of combat is also quite different from what From Software has been doing lately. Instead of the typical circle strafe nonsense, Sekiro has a simplistic parry system. Simply perform a regular block just before an enemy attack lands, and the player will deal damage to the enemy's posture. Once their posture is broken, they can then be killed instantly with a death blow. This makes battles in the game very fast and short-lived, as a couple of successful blocks leads to an instant kill. It is pretty exciting, but I can't help but feel how automatic and hand-holding it can be at times. Again, unlike the Souls games where a parry animation was long, deliberate, and risky, in Sekiro you just have to time your blocks. It's also really strange that there isn't a consistent punishment for having your own posture broken. Half the time, the enemy will miss the follow-up attack and give you ample time to regain your balance. This is on top of the fact that half of the cannon fodder enemies in the game can just have their posture easily broken by spamming the regular attack against their guard, which basically just kills them instantly without even trying. It is kind of interesting the way the game is balanced and laid out. Typically, most video games would ramp up the difficulty and always have stronger enemies waiting ahead, while Sekiro is more of a roller coaster ride, with the halfway point having a bunch of opponents who can't do a whole lot against your sword. That said, it's never an easy time when facing larger groups of enemies, and that's where the stealth approach comes into play. Whether it's dropping down from above or crawling through tall grass, the game can be made a lot easier by quietly thinning out the enemy numbers. Once again, it feels pretty automatic and easy to get through. Very much so a light stealth game, but it's still plenty cool. Thankfully, where Sekiro really shines are the boss battles. It's the same general rules that had already been established, but now it's for an enemy that doesn't die right away, so the player can flex their mastery of the game's controls. These fights are incredibly fun, trying to quickly examine an enemy's combos and learn the timing for blocking each individual hit. In that sense, it plays out very much like a rhythm game. The best fights are duels against a weapon-toting rival. However, the game occasionally mixes this up and sometimes doesn't do a great job at it. I don't mean the set-piece moments, like against a giant snake. Those are fine because they're short and out of the way quickly. However, the bull is such an annoying fight and not fun at all. It just rampages and thrashes all around non-stop. The ogre is arguably even worse, especially considering how early in the game he is. He completely goes against the previously established rules by having a moveset mainly comprised of unblockable attacks. I'm also pretty sure that the game never explains that it's possible to run full sprint in all directions while locked onto an enemy, which would have been a really nice tidbit to know the first time around. The ogre is a massive wall to overcome if you're still getting used to the game, but once you know how to overcome it, then it's a piece of cake. It's such an awful opening for an otherwise excellent game. Ogre and Bull are horrible early impressions, but it does get better from there. So I ragged on this game quite a bit, but I gotta make it clear that I had an absolute blast. And even though I focused in on two of the weaker early bosses, most of the battles in this game are fantastic and wonderfully memorable. I do believe that it'll take a while for it to really click with most players, even more so if you strictly approach it as a Souls game. The gameplay is initially not very straightforward at all, and it doesn't do a good job at teaching the player the finer mechanics. And this is despite the game having the most fleshed out tutorial that From Software has put out lately, even going so far as to have a dedicated training partner that you can go back to anytime. However, more than that, it's also a very simple game where rushing through and spamming attacks will get you by just fine half the time. And little things like the annoying upgrade tree or the false dragon rot that's just meant to scare the player really brings down the game quite a bit. I enjoyed Sekiro a ton, and I would love to see From Software try this style again, either with a sequel or with a new setting entirely. However, if I'm looking at this from an objective standpoint, then this is a pretty flawed game. Not nearly flawed enough to ruin any sort of enjoyment, however. So with that in mind, I still say that it is highly recommended. You might have to give it a bit of a chance, but I'm sure most people will absolutely love this game. Thanks for watching my review on Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. And I know I'm awfully late, but Happy New Year, everyone.